America bombed Venezuela today. The official justification frames this as action against a brutal dictator, threatening regional stability and American interests. The unstated reality is more complicated and more damning. American policies over the past decade are precisely why Nicolas Maduro remains in power. The sanctions that were supposed to collapse his regime instead strengthened his grip. The diplomatic recognition of his opponent proved humiliating when that opponent never governed anything. The isolation that was meant to weaken him drove him into the arms of Russia and China, who provided exactly the support needed for regime survival. Now, America bombs the dictator that American policy created and sustained. This isn't incompetence, it's pattern. And understanding the pattern requires examining how intervention consistently produces the opposite of its stated goals. Venezuela's current disaster has roots that long predate Maduro. Hugo Chávez came to power in 1999 with genuine popular support, based on promises to redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth to the poor. For over a decade, high oil prices allowed Chávez to fund massive social programs, literacy campaigns, healthcare clinics, subsidized food that improved living standards for millions of Venezuelans who'd been excluded from the country's oil wealth. But the programs were built on unsustainable economics. Rather than investing oil revenues in productive capacity that could sustain social spending when prices fell, the Chávez government spent everything on immediate consumption and political patronage. State-owned enterprises were looted by corruption. Private sector investment collapsed as Chávez nationalized industries. The economy became completely dependent on oil revenue to import everything from food to medicine to consumer goods. When Chávez died in 2013, Maduro inherited this fundamentally broken economic model, just as oil prices began their collapse from over $100 per barrel to below $30. The result was catastrophic. Without oil revenue to sustain imports, the economy contracted. Inflation accelerated into hyperinflation that peaked above 1,000,000%, making currency essentially worthless. GDP contracted by over 70% between 2013 and 2020, one of the most severe peacetime economic collapses in modern history. The human cost was devastating. Hospitals ran out of medicine and basic supplies. Malnutrition became widespread. Preventable diseases returned. Over 7 million Venezuelans, nearly a quarter of the population, fled to Colombia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and other regional countries, creating a refugee crisis that destabilized neighbors. Those who remained faced poverty, hunger, and a collapsing state that couldn't provide basic services. This disaster created political opportunity for opposition. Maduro was broadly unpopular. The regime's economic failures were undeniable. Fair elections would almost certainly have removed him from power. But American intervention transformed this political opportunity into regime consolidation. The Trump administration imposed comprehensive sanctions starting in 2017, escalating through 2019 to include oil sector sanctions that effectively prohibited Venezuela from selling oil to most international buyers. The stated goal was straightforward. Economic pressure would make Maduro's position untenable, forcing regime change either through collapse or military coup. The assumptions underlying this strategy proved entirely wrong. Sanctions didn't weaken Maduro's grip. They strengthened it through several mechanisms that American policymakers apparently didn't anticipate or didn't care about. First, sanctions provided exactly the external enemy narrative that authoritarian regimes need to maintain power when failing economically. Before sanctions, Maduro had to explain economic collapse as the result of his own policies. An impossible position. After sanctions, he could blame everything on American economic warfare. The narrative shift was crucial. Ordinary Venezuelans suffering from food shortages and hyperinflation could be told their suffering wasn't Maduro's fault. It was American sanctions deliberately starving Venezuelans to force regime change. This narrative had the advantage of being partially true. The sanctions did make economic conditions worse by limiting Venezuela's ability to export oil and access international financial systems. That the underlying economic disaster predated sanctions and resulted from Chavista policies became harder to argue when American sanctions were actively making things worse. Second, sanctions consolidated the regime's political coalition by ensuring that those with access to state resources, the military, security services, and regime-connected businesses, benefited from scarcity. When imports were limited and currency controls created massive arbitrage opportunities, those controlling access to dollars and import licenses could extract enormous rents. The worse the general economic situation, the more valuable access to regime-controlled resources became. This created powerful incentives for the regime coalition to maintain Maduro in power. A democratic transition would mean losing access to the corruption opportunities that sanctions-induced scarcity created. The military and security services that might have abandoned Maduro in pursuit of economic normalization instead had strong financial incentives to keep him in power precisely because sanctions made their privileged access more valuable. Third, sanctions pushed Venezuela deeper into dependence on Russia and China, who provided exactly the economic and political support needed for regime survival. This wasn't theoretical. It happened systematically and predictably. China had invested heavily in Venezuelan oil infrastructure and held billions in Venezuelan debt. When American sanctions threatened Venezuela's ability to export oil and service debt, China had strong incentives to help Venezuela survive. Chinese financing continued flowing. Chinese companies purchased Venezuelan oil that American sanctions prevented from reaching other markets. Chinese investment in infrastructure, mining, and telecommunications deepened despite or because of American sanctions, making Venezuela more dependent on Chinese support. Russia's support was equally crucial. When protests threatened Maduro in 2019, Russian security contractors and advisors helped regime forces suppress dissent. Russian financing provided cash when sanctions cut Venezuela off from international financial systems. Russian diplomatic support at the UN Security Council prevented international action that might have increased pressure on Maduro. Russia purchased Venezuelan oil and provided refining capacity when American sanctions limited other options. This support wasn't altruism. Russia and China extracted favorable terms: oil at discounted prices, favorable agreements on mineral rights, long-term contracts that locked in Chinese and Russian access to Venezuelan resources. But from Maduro's perspective, the terms didn't matter. What mattered was survival, and Russia and China provided the lifeline that made survival possible when American sanctions threatened collapse. The concrete mechanisms of this support were extensive and systematic. Chinese state-owned oil companies purchased Venezuelan crude at prices 20 to 30% below market rates, but provided immediate cash when no other buyers were available. Russian oil company Rosneft facilitated Venezuelan oil exports through intermediary companies that could evade American sanctions tracking. Chinese banks provided billions in financing when American sanctions cut Venezuela off from Western financial systems. The terms were harsh by normal standards. Venezuela mortgaged future oil production at unfavorable rates. Chinese companies gained mining rights to gold and other minerals on terms that would have been rejected under normal circumstances. Russian security contractors operated with immunity from Venezuelan law, but these weren't normal circumstances. Maduro faced potential regime collapse. Under those conditions, any terms that ensured survival were acceptable. The network dynamics described earlier operated perfectly. When an authoritarian regime faced existential threat from Western pressure, other authoritarian powers provided the support needed for survival. The worse American sanctions made Venezuela's isolation from Western economies, the more dependent Venezuela became on authoritarian network support, the stronger Maduro's position became relative to domestic opposition. The Guaido recognition demonstrated American strategic incoherence at its most visible. In January 2019, the Trump administration recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president, despite Guaido having no control over government, military, or territory. Over 50 countries followed America's lead in recognizing Guaido. The theory was that international recognition would give Guaido legitimacy that would translate into power, that military officers would defect to the legitimate government, that regime officials would abandon Maduro, that international isolation would force Maduro to negotiate departure. None of this happened. Maduro controlled the military, security services, and state apparatus. International recognition of Guaido meant nothing when Guaido couldn't govern, couldn't provide services, couldn't pay salaries, couldn't exercise any actual governmental functions. The recognition became farcical as months passed, with Guaido recognized as president by dozens of countries, while Maduro actually governed Venezuela. The episode damaged American credibility substantially. If the United States and its allies could recognize someone as president who obviously wasn't president and couldn't become president without outside military intervention, what did American recognition mean? The gap between American declarations and reality was too obvious to ignore. By 2020, even American allies were quietly backing away from Guaido recognition, as it became clear he would never govern. The opposition fractured between those supporting Guaido's maximalist position and those willing to negotiate with Maduro. The disunity that American policy was supposed to overcome instead deepened as different opposition factions blamed each other for the strategy's failure. Maduro benefited from every aspect of the failure. He could point to American recognition of Guaido as proof of American intervention and coup plotting. He could present his own survival, despite American pressure, as evidence of strength and legitimacy. The opposition divided itself while Maduro consolidated control. American policy achieved the opposite of its stated goal. The historical pattern is consistent and should have been predictable. American intervention in Latin America has consistently strengthened the governments it opposed or created worse alternatives. Chile 1973 provides the classic example. When Salvador Allende's socialist government nationalized copper mines and pursued leftist policies, the Nixon administration supported the military coup that installed Augusto Pinochet. The goal was preventing another Cuba. The result was a brutal dictatorship that killed thousands, tortured tens of thousands, and traumatized Chilean society for generations. Pinochet was far worse than Allende by any measure except American geopolitical preferences. Nicaragua in the 1980s demonstrated similar dynamics. American support for Contra rebels fighting the Sandinista government didn't weaken the Sandinistas. It strengthened them by providing the foreign enemy that justified military mobilization and political repression. Daniel Ortega used American intervention to consolidate power and silence domestic opposition as unpatriotic during wartime. The intervention radicalized Nicaraguan politics and made Ortega stronger than he'd been before American intervention. Cuba, after the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, showed the pattern even more clearly. The failed American-backed invasion didn't weaken Castro, it gave him exactly the external threat narrative he needed to consolidate the revolution, eliminate internal dissent, and justify alignment with the Soviet Union. What might have remained a nationalist revolution hostile to American business interests became a committed Soviet ally specifically because American intervention forced Castro to seek powerful external support. Before the Bay of Pigs, Castro's revolution was nationalist and anti-American, but not necessarily communist or Soviet-aligned. Castro had come to power through guerrilla warfare against the Batista dictatorship that the United States had supported. He nationalized American-owned properties and pursued land reform, but his ideological orientation was more populist nationalism than communist ideology. The Bay of Pigs invasion changed everything. When American-backed Cuban exiles invaded in April 1961, Castro could present himself as Cuba's defender against American imperialism, trying to reimpose a puppet government. The invasion failed militarily. Cuban forces defeated the exile brigade within 72 hours. But politically, it was Castro's greatest victory. Castro used the invasion to justify comprehensive political repression. Thousands of suspected opposition supporters were arrested. Independent media was shut down completely. The revolution radicalized leftward, and crucially, Castro aligned completely with the Soviet Union as the only power capable of protecting Cuba from future American intervention. The Soviet alignment brought military advisors, economic assistance, and ultimately nuclear missiles that nearly triggered global war in 1962. All of this, the repression, the communist consolidation, the Soviet alliance, became possible and politically sustainable because American intervention proved Castro's claims about American threats to Cuban sovereignty. What might have remained a nationalist revolution hostile to American business interests became a committed Soviet ally, specifically because American intervention forced Castro to seek powerful external support. The pattern repeats because the incentive structures are consistent. When the United States intervenes against a government, through sanctions, coup support, or military action, that government has powerful incentives to present the intervention as existential threat, requiring national unity. Opposition to the government becomes opposition to national survival against foreign aggression. This allows authoritarian regimes to conflate legitimate political opposition with foreign-backed treason. Simultaneously, intervention drives the targeted government to seek support from America's rivals. If American pressure threatens regime survival, Russia and China become essential allies regardless of the costs. The intervention creates exactly the foreign dependency and anti-American alignment that American policy claims to prevent. The Venezuela bombing today fits this pattern perfectly while potentially accelerating it. Maduro was already presenting himself as Venezuela's defender against American aggression. Now that presentation has been validated by actual American bombs. Every Venezuelan who might have opposed Maduro on economic or political grounds now faces the question: do you support your country against foreign attack, or do you support the foreign attacker? The rally round the flag effect is well documented. When a country faces external military threat, domestic political opposition typically diminishes as citizens unite against the external enemy, regardless of their views on their own government. This effect is particularly strong when the external threat is perceived as unjust aggression, rather than legitimate response to genuine provocation. The effect is measurable and predictable. After the September 11th attacks, President Bush's approval rating jumped from 51% to 90% in 2 weeks. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Zelensky's approval ratings surged, despite previous unpopularity. After external attacks, even unpopular leaders see temporary surges in public support as national identity supersedes political disagreement. Maduro's approval ratings have been consistently low, polling in the 20–30% range in surveys where respondents feel safe answering honestly. But the bombing changes the political calculus entirely. Venezuelans who despise Maduro for economic mismanagement and authoritarianism still face a question. When foreign bombs are falling, do you support your government or the foreign power dropping bombs? Most people, even those who hate their government, will choose their country over foreign attackers. This isn't endorsement of Maduro. It's rejection of foreign intervention. But the practical effect is the same. Political opposition becomes harder to express when it can be framed as supporting foreign aggression. Opposition politicians who criticized Maduro yesterday now face impossible choices. If they criticize the American bombing, they validate Maduro's narrative and abandon their criticism of his government. If they support the bombing or remain silent, they're vulnerable to accusations of supporting foreign attack on Venezuela. The political space for legitimate opposition collapses when American bombs create the context where opposing the government means appearing to support foreign aggression. Military officers who might have considered abandoning Maduro now face different calculations. Defecting to the opposition when American bombs are falling looks like treason during wartime, rather than legitimate political choice. The officers who control whether Maduro stays or goes are far more likely to remain loyal when that loyalty can be framed as patriotic defense of Venezuela, rather than support for a failed leader. The bombing also provides perfect justification for political repression. Opposition media can be shut down for providing aid and comfort to foreign enemies during wartime. Protests can be banned as security threats. Opposition politicians can be arrested on charges of coordinating with foreign powers. All the authoritarian tools that looked abusive when used against peaceful domestic opposition become defensible as wartime security measures when American bombs provide the context. China and Russia will exploit this opportunity systematically. Their message to Latin America is ready-made. We respect sovereignty and don't bomb countries we disagree with. America claims to support democracy, but bombs Venezuela when it doesn't get the government it wants. Who is the real threat to your independence? This message will resonate across a region with long memories of American intervention. Chinese investment and Russian security cooperation will increase specifically because the bombing demonstrates their value. Venezuela needs support more than ever against American pressure. Other Latin American governments will draw conclusions about the value of diversifying partnerships beyond the United States. The bombing doesn't just strengthen Maduro, it strengthens the case for regional alignment with China and Russia. The economic dimension reveals the self-defeating nature of the policy even more clearly. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels, but it's heavy crude requiring specialized refining capacity. American Gulf Coast refineries were specifically designed to process Venezuelan heavy crude. For decades, this created mutual dependence. Venezuela needed American refining capacity. America benefited from Venezuelan oil. Sanctions broke this relationship, forcing Venezuela to redirect oil exports to China at discounted prices. Chinese refineries gained experience processing Venezuelan crude. The relationship became institutionalized through long-term contracts and Chinese investment in Venezuelan production and transportation infrastructure. American refineries that depended on Venezuelan heavy crude had to source from elsewhere at higher cost or modify operations. The bombing accelerates this permanent reorientation. Even if Maduro eventually falls, even if sanctions are eventually lifted, the relationships built during the sanctions period won't simply disappear. Chinese companies that invested in Venezuelan infrastructure during the crisis will have long-term contracts and political relationships that survive any particular government. The oil that previously flowed to American refineries will continue flowing to Chinese ones because the infrastructure and relationships now point that direction. American policy has successfully reoriented Venezuelan oil exports toward China. Exactly the outcome American policy supposedly aims to prevent. The irony would be amusing if the consequences weren't so serious. The refugee crisis adds another dimension of self-defeating policy. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. These refugees strain social services and political stability in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and other receiving countries. The crisis creates political ammunition for right-wing politicians across the region who campaign on anti-immigrant platforms. American policy contributed directly to this crisis through sanctions that worsened economic conditions and drove emigration. The bombing will likely accelerate refugee flows as Venezuelans flee potential escalation. The regional instability this creates will then be cited as evidence of the need for more American intervention to address the problems American intervention helped create. The feedback loop is vicious and self-reinforcing. The humanitarian catastrophe in Venezuela is real and attributable primarily to Chavista economic policies. But American intervention has consistently made it worse while strengthening the regime responsible. This isn't defense of Maduro. It's recognition that American policy achieves the opposite of its stated goals. The question is why this pattern persists despite consistent failure. Several factors explain the disconnect between policy and outcomes. Domestic political incentives in the United States reward appearing tough on foreign adversaries, regardless of whether toughness produces desired results. Politicians gain support by advocating strong action against dictators. The costs of intervention, whether human costs in targeted countries or strategic costs to American interests, are diffuse and delayed. The political benefits of appearing strong are immediate and concentrated. This means politicians can advocate policies that they should know will fail, suffer no political consequences when the policies predictably fail, and then advocate more of the same failed policies in response to the failures they created. The incentive structure punishes strategic thinking and rewards performative toughness. Institutional imperatives within the national security bureaucracy also drive continued intervention. Sanctions offices, intelligence analysts focused on Venezuela, military planners developing contingency operations, all have institutional interests in continued focus on Venezuela, regardless of whether that focus produces positive outcomes. The bureaucracy sustains itself through continued engagement with the problem even when that engagement makes the problem worse. Ideological commitment to the idea that American power should reshape other countries' politics makes it difficult to acknowledge when intervention fails. Admitting that sanctions strengthened Maduro rather than weakening him requires acknowledging limits to American power and questioning the entire interventionist framework. This is psychologically difficult for policymakers invested in American exceptionalism and military dominance. The sunk cost fallacy operates powerfully. Having invested significant political capital and resources in efforts to remove Maduro, policymakers face strong psychological pressure to escalate rather than admit failure. Bombing Venezuela can be framed as necessary escalation of an ongoing campaign, rather than acknowledgement that previous approaches failed and produced results opposite to those intended. The result is policy trapped in patterns that consistently fail to achieve stated objectives while creating the conditions that make stated objectives harder to achieve. We sanction Venezuela, strengthening Maduro. We recognize his opponent, embarrassing ourselves when the opponent never governs. We isolate Venezuela, driving it toward Russia and China. And now we bomb Venezuela, giving Maduro exactly what he needs to consolidate power, silence opposition, and present himself as Venezuela's defender against foreign aggression. The bombing won't weaken Maduro. It will strengthen him. It won't promote democracy. It will justify repression. It won't advance American interests. It will drive Venezuela deeper into dependence on Russia and China, while damaging American credibility across Latin America. We know this because we've seen this pattern repeatedly. Chile, Nicaragua, Cuba, each intervention strengthened what it opposed or created worse alternatives. The tragedy is that this is predictable and predicted. Analysts warned that sanctions would strengthen Maduro. Regional experts explained that Guaido recognition would fail. The outcomes weren't surprising. They were obvious to anyone examining historical patterns, rather than indulging ideological fantasies about American power reshaping other countries' politics through punishment. America bombs Venezuela today, claiming to oppose dictatorship. The bombing will strengthen the dictator. We've created the threat we claim to fight. We sustain it through intervention. And when intervention predictably fails, we escalate. The pattern is consistent, the outcomes predictable, and the policy unchanged. The Maduro paradox is complete. We bomb the dictator we created, strengthening him further, ensuring he survives to justify more intervention. The cycle continues because admitting it doesn't work would require questioning assumptions that American foreign policy cannot question.